All right. I'm John Stoner, and I am with John Stoner, and that was not an echo that you heard. Okay. The two of us today are going to focus on um, everyone wants to rule the world of data, and obviously the picture here in the bottom right is not the two of us, but they're the folks who helped inspire the idea for the title of this slide. I'm this John Stoner. My focus is kind of from today, coming from the SecOps angle. So as we're talking about the different pieces of this presentation, I'm going to try to bring a little bit of a SecOps flavor to this. And I'm the one who has the alt 80s sad timey music references. So I apologize for any of those that pop up both in the abstract as well as in the slides here. Over to you, John.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm the other John Stoner, U.S. Army veteran. I'm the one with the Mohawk. So I've done a lot of different things in cybersecurity the last 15 years since I've been out of the Army. But I mostly have specialized in threat intel by far the most, in addition to some of the other work that I've done there as well. So for purposes of this presentation today, you're going to get the SecOps side of things and sort of the threat intel side of things, all about data. And then this is what our talk is going to kind of focus on today. So we're going to kind of go over what do we mean when we say all of the data. We're going to talk about cyber intelligence engineering. We're going to talk about the threat intel platform and SIMs, PIRs, if you're not familiar with those a little bit, how that will tie in, some concerns around normalization and data processing, some interesting concepts and considerations around the balance of data. Then we're going to kind of put all of this in together for a very little mini case study around Volt Typhoon, and then we'll wrap things up.
All right. So to kind of start contextualizing where we're starting, this is the world that we're living in. We took 5 slices of this pie. I'm sure depending on the organization size, we could slice this much finer. If it's a smaller organization, it maybe is going to be a few less slices. But kind of starting from the right-hand side, we have security operations, right? We have folks that are looking at logs and trying to understand and make sense of those and applying detection logic. We have incident responders who might be going ahead and conducting investigations, pulling boxes, trying to figure out what happened. We've got the vulnerability management folks out there, right, who are going ahead and saying, hey, here are the vulnerabilities that we need to be patching. Here's the risk that we have associated with that. And of course, we have the threat hunters assuming breach, going out there and looking for things. And the piece that kind of pulls a lot of these other parts together is the CTI component. Now, hopefully we're working from a common mission or business requirement. And if we're not, things kind of start breaking down right from there. But let's assume that we are. But CTI has this wonderful relationship with all of these other different entities from a SecOps perspective, an incident response perspective, a vulnerability management perspective, and a threat hunting perspective to be able to provide information that's actionable, that's helpful to these other organizations. And if done right, they can also help inform the CTI team. So what do we mean by all the data? We could probably have a spirited discussion about what these different bullet points actually cover, and if they are actually in the right spots. We'll be back over at the conference and happy to do that after today's session. But breaking this kind of high level down into tactical, operational, strategic, which I know CTI folks definitely think of data in that perspective. On the SecOps side, we bring things like raw logs, normalized data, asset and identity context, right? Those kinds of things to the game, and we need to understand what those things are. We generally run detection logic to create operational alerts, right? To have something happen. From a SecOps perspective, we might run playbooks against cases to go ahead and remediate. And then more at the strategic level to think about how are we functioning, how are we doing? We're going to probably have performance metrics. But we also deal with governance, risk and compliance, where we might be able to sit there and say, okay, how are we doing against this specific compliance standard as well? So there's all of this kind of data out there. And from a SecOps perspective, those are a couple of key areas that we, from a SecOps perspective, are going to leverage.
Yeah, I mean, from a CTI perspective, again, we can have arguments over where some of this might fit on the CTI side of the house. Even with intelligence reporting, you'll see intelligence reporting in each of those categories, because generally there's some level of intelligence reporting for both for tactical, operational, and strategic, right? At strategic, you might be talking about like a year-end wrap-up of information where the key stakeholder is the executives or the board. Whereas at the tactical level, right, we might have like a spot report or like a real quick sit rep about something to get TTPs and IOCs out there. The other thing that you'll start to see even on this slide is how much of the data will serve more than one purpose, right? There is no data that's only really interesting to the CTI team or data that's only really interesting to the SecOps team. A lot of this data will be interesting to multiple teams in your organization. So the other thing that's starting to happen within CTI is, and I'll make this story brief for our time today, is a lot of people have focused on the reports. A lot of people in CTI have come out of DoD, NatSec, the Intel community with similar backgrounds where we're really focused on analyzing the adversary, right, mapping TTPs, getting that report out to customers. I think CTI is starting to take a little bit more of a technical approach, and I have heard this term out in the world before. Whether cyber intelligence engineering is the term that sticks or not, we'll see. But you have to focus on that underlying architecture, like during Rick's introduction, right? It's not just the report itself. How are we ensuring that we're collecting the right data? How are we processing that data? Where's the automation and scalability? Are we integrating AI into our system so that we can analyze the huge amounts of data that exist now? How are we integrating the systems? So this concept of cyber intelligence engineering is that your CTI team at a certain maturity level needs to have this underpinning of a more technical approach to ensure that you're dealing and getting all of the data into the right systems, especially across the cross-functional teams that we mentioned.
Which brings us to the TIPs and the SIMs. So TIPs, threat intelligence platforms, SIMs, security incident and event management systems. That's been a long time since I actually had to pull out the acronym for that. But the idea behind these is these are large repositories of data sets that can be very impactful to the different organizations. From a SIM perspective, right, we're going to ingest disparate data sets. And when we say disparate data sets, what do we mean? Cisco routers, Palo Alto firewalls, CrowdStrike endpoint detection, Linux audit logs, and badge systems, and more and more and more, right? So all sorts of different kinds of data sets that we can apply detection logic to try to figure out what's happening. One of those other data sets that we can take advantage of in a SIM is data from a TIP, specifically things like indicators, right? Hashes, IP addresses, domains, and those things can be very, very helpful. Now, from a SIM perspective, one of the things that we have to think about is, are we able to confirm that the logs are in fact coming into the SIM? And this is a common pitfall. We'll come back to this a little bit later, but we have to be asking ourselves that. The other thing that we have to be asking ourselves in terms of this is, do the right people have access to the information to be able to go ahead and do something? And that seems kind of self-evident, but you'd be surprised that, maybe the threat intel team can benefit from having visibility into the SIM, just like the SIM team should have visibility into the threat intelligence platform. You see that dotted line at the bottom of the screen, and the top one's solid because everybody, I won't say everybody, many people will go ahead and ingest indicators from a TIP. That's fairly well understood. I guess the other question I have is how often does the threat intel platform benefit from the data collected in the SIM? And I'm not talking about the raw logs, but I am talking about those incidents, those cases, those things that the incident responders are working on and they can potentially learn from to go ahead and inform that threat intelligence platform to know more about the specific campaign or actor.
Yeah, I think, just to wrap up this slide is, in most cases, right, the TIP is feeding the SIM, but it may be beneficial for the SIM to feed some information back into the TIP. And then to your point, if you have a threat hunt capability or vulnerability management team, which system are they getting their information from? Right? If you've never really had that discussion, they may need access to both systems. Where is your IR case data? Is that making it back to the threat intel team? Because that would be very valuable. So these are some other things to think about with this concept. And that kind of ties into, what are your intelligence requirements? So, we refer to these generally as priority intelligence requirements. They go by a number of different names. This is a very sort of US government-centric way to think about them. But if you don't have priority intelligence requirements, and if things aren't prioritized, then you'll be chasing every rabbit hole that comes down into the CTI team. So ideally, you have some sort of priority intelligence requirements that are aligning with the business objectives. You may be That might tie into sort of like a crown jewel analysis if you're protecting certain pieces of your architecture, or data sets more than you are, especially if you're like a global company, everything might not be protected at the same level. You want to focus on relevant threats to your industry. Just because your CISO read something about Salt Typhoon doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be a potential victim of Salt Typhoon. Probably if you're not a telecommunications company, it may not be a priority. You might be able to just, give them some high level talking points about that and let them know that we don't think that's a priority for us. And then all of this is actionable. And what we mean with that is intelligence is not the mission. You might see those stickers around also. Intelligence is to help drive the mission. It's helped to reduce risk. It's how intelligence helps make decisions. So you want to think about that when you're prioritizing what you want to focus on. Is that the really cool APT report is not necessarily really beneficial to the business? Does that help someone make a decision?
All right. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of the challenges and pitfalls we have as we start looking at the SecOps and the CTI pieces coming together. We bring up this slide just to kind of highlight and kind of help you kind of think about this as we go. And obviously I can't see you all, so I can't ask for a show of hands here. But I guess I'd be curious to know how many folks have themselves and their team, and then their organization, and then their sensors, and their data, and their adversaries, all in one of those slices of color swatch, okay? The time zone. If they're all in that one time zone, congratulations, we don't have to worry about time zone. However, I think at this point, that's a very, 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 very small subset of folks out there. And we have to be thinking about time zone as we're collecting our logs, as we're analyzing, as we're looking at where our adversaries are coming from, both from a threat intel perspective and, like I said, from a detection perspective. And so understanding and setting common clocks, which again feels like very, very fundamental kinds of things, but is a huge problem that if they're not in place before things happen, it becomes a tremendous disadvantage to the defender after something has happened. Now, it does take a little bit of getting used to, right? Your analysts are looking at the clock and it says, 7 p.m. and I'll just use the AM PM because it's easier, and it's 0000 GMT, right? Depending upon the time of year we're at, and that can get a little bit confusing, but they'll get around to it. Having a common clock, even if you want to just say, hey, we're going to do East Coast time for everybody, that's fine, but pick a specific time zone. Make sure the sensors are all using that time zone. Make sure the detection engineering systems using that time zone. Make sure the threat intel teams are using that time zone, and standardize.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've ever heard of an incident, right, for incident response where this has never been an issue to some degree. Sometimes it's very bad, sometimes it's still minimal, but I don't know that I've ever heard from our incident responder friends that this has never been an issue.
Another challenge that we see oftentimes is striking the balance between the data. And when we say striking the balance, we're talking about we have this vast quantity of internal data. We have a quantity of external data, depending upon the organization. These things can range in terms of how much you have. But think about this from an internal perspective. You have IR cases, you have hunts that you've conducted, you have SOC detection alerts, you have logging, you might have packet capture, which that can get a little bit voluminous. So that's something handled with care. But you have all of this information about things that are happening on your network that can be extremely valuable, both to the defender from a SecOps perspective, but also to the threat intel analyst to understand what to work with. On the opposite side of the equation, you have external data, and this can be, your threat intel, which we'll kind of touch on kind of separately in a second. But we've got CVEs and vulnerability reports. We've got that pen test report that organization did for you, and you read it, and you're like, that's great, and you put it in the file cabinet. There's value in that pen test report, again, that can inform the threat intel analyst, the threat hunters, the detection engineers, but we got to make sure that we do something with all of this, but we can't go 100% to the internal, 100% to the external. We have to find that balance.
Yeah, another good place where there's a sort of a balance in data is when we talk about vulnerabilities. I was over there at the conference earlier today talking about how few companies actually have an asset inventory list. That's really fundamental. If you have a vulnerability management program, hopefully your threat intel team is coordinating with your vulnerability management program to prioritize things that are applicable, which you only know what's applicable if you have an asset list somewhere. But you're probably getting some internal data, right? Your asset inventory list. You also are going to get the external data, right? You're going to get the CVE reports. Maybe you're categorizing or focusing priority based on, the CVE rating. Maybe you're looking at this is a known exploited vulnerability database, right? There's a couple different ways your team might want to handle that, but that is, again, is a really good balance of we need both internal and external data to do that successfully.
All right, this is another pet peeve is probably too strong of a word, but let's talk about normalization. And when we talk about normalization, you might be thinking, okay, we got to get the data parsed right, and that's important. Don't get me wrong. But let's get farther down the trail here and start talking about data normalization as analysts are communicating and talking with one another. Now, again, I can't see anybody on the call to sit there and say show of hands, but I suspect that a few of you, when you're dealing with APT29, might refer to them as APT29. On the other hand, maybe you call them Midnight Blizzard, or you call them Grizzly Steppe, or you call them let's see here, Cozy Bear. Yeah, and then the last one that I saved here, and there's many more, is Iron Hemlock. And John hasn't heard a lot of Iron Hemlock, apparently. He's shaking his head. But when we stop and start thinking about this, right, we're talking about, Mandiant Google, Microsoft, CrowdStrike, the US government, and SecureWorks. That's 5 different names for the same problem set, the same threat actor. And again, that's just 5. That's not all of the other ones. How do we communicate with one another when I'm sitting here looking at detections, or I'm threat hunting, and I go to John here as my CTI analyst and saying, hey, I'm seeing this, and I'm seeing it from Grizzly Steppe, and he's going, Grizzly Steppe. Okay, let me go through my mental translator, and he's talking about APT29. It makes it very, very difficult for folks to communicate in a common vernacular without having those standards in place. And yeah, this one's maybe an easy one. You say, of course, Midnight Blizzard, APT29, Grizzly Steppe. We all know that one already. That's the one we do know. What about all those other ones that we have to be focused on that we need to have? So think about normalization, think about standardization. An updated data is another great example of this. When you say something's been updated in the system, are we talking the IOC's been updated? When was it updated? What does that impact downstream for the SecOps teams that's ingesting that? What is that updated? What's that lifespan on that indicator mean also? And then when the SecOps team does something and it's updated, what does that mean back to the threat intel team? And I realize these seem like really basic things, but you'd be surprised how many people get tripped up by these.
Yeah, another big one that you probably need to consider in terms of data normalization for all of this to work correctly is what happens when MITRE ATT&CK changes or updates the framework, right? Pretty much everyone is using MITRE ATT&CK in some capacity nowadays. So what happens when there's an update to that? Oh, you're probably not going back and remapping things, but that might affect things in the future. And are you upgrading the TIP and the SIM at the same time? You might have different vendors for those products. Are they upgrading at the same time? What happens when there's another TLP update, right? Traffic light protocol, right? How we sort of like classify threat intel has been updated in the past. Well, what happens if TLP 3.0 or whatever comes out? Like, are you going to go back? Are you just going to, draw a line in the sand and we're going to use the new standard from here? Do all of the other vendor tools you have, are they upgrading on the same time with the new standard and framework updates? These are important things to keep in mind for sort of data normalization across all your different systems and teams.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the relevant data or the relevant information that you might have. And oftentimes, again, we probably, I don't want to say everybody feels this way, but I know I feel this way sometimes, that you're sitting there and you're standing in the middle of the hay field, or I don't know if it's really hay, because it's hay after you make it. So we'll apologize. I'm not up on my farming. But oftentimes we're looking across this endless field of haystacks, right? And we're being tasked with finding the needle in the haystack. And there's so many haystacks, we don't even know which one to target our focus on. And so, sometimes you kind of get a little bit of a helpless feeling from that perspective. But what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about from a data and information perspective, right? Of course, the first thing we need to think about is, are we collecting all of the data that we need from the logical places to be able to have it available to us? And you know what? I think at this point in time, a lot of people are getting pretty good at collecting data, right? We've got the data. The next question becomes is, once you've got the data, do you have it in the place? This is the forwarding part of this. to a place that it can be of the most use. And sometimes I think that's some of an area that folks kind of start slipping a little bit is I've got the data, but man, it's in that other system over there. It's in that data lake over there. Or, oh, the tip guys have it, but the SIM guys don't. Or the SIM guys have it, but the tip guys don't, right? So we need to be thinking about this to say, what is the role of the data? Who does the data serve? And do the right people have the data in the place so that they can make the most use out of it? And then the question after that becomes, are we collecting all the necessary information, or are we collecting lots of stuff? Great, we met that. We're collecting all the stuff, but man, about 50 to 60% of this is garbage, which is really kind of depressing if you think about it. But if you don't have a great way of handling packet capture, is that where you might want to spend all of a good chunk of your time handling that packet capture? Maybe it is because you need it for that rainy day, right? And if that's the reason, that's great. But you need to think about this strategically and say, okay, what is the data that we need? What's the, what's that 90% that we need all the time, right? What's that 5% that we need some of the time? What's that 3% we need once in a while? And then what's that 1% that, is really, really for that break glass kind of thing. But thinking about your data in that manner to be able to say, hey, we want to prioritize collection. We want to prioritize detection engineering. We want to prioritize reporting from that perspective.
Right. And we didn't even talk about an insider threat team earlier when we were, if you have an organization that has that level of maturity, right, what data does the insider threat team need to correlate? Do they need all the badge logs? Do they need all the physical logs, right? And which system has that? Because in a lot of cases, that information is in a separate system. Well, how do they correlate that information to find out, is this an insider threat action, or is this a cyber actor threat action on the network? Right. So there's a lot of data considerations in here, depending on how your specific organizational structure is set up.
And then the last potential pitfall that we're going to kind of highlight here, and we talked about internal, external a few slides ago in the balance of data, but we wanted to kind of have a separate one focusing specifically on external and internal threat intelligence. External threat intelligence is wonderful, right? It gives us a view into things that maybe we weren't aware of before. It allows speciality of collection from external threat intel vendors who can go ahead and say, hey, we were really focused on APT or really focused on cybercrime or what have you. And that's great, and we don't want to dissuade folks from leveraging that, right? And you set up relationships with ISACs to get data there. You set up relationships with other people in your vertical, and right, and there's time and effort expense there. So we want to take advantage of those things, but don't forget what I kind of like to think of as the locally sourced, artisanally curated internal threat intelligence that you have yourself, because it's yours, because it's local, because it's about you. That can be even more impactful than all of the other stuff because it's about the things that have happened to you in your environment.
Yeah, I think it's really easy for the threat intel team to get enamored with their vendor intelligence or with what CISA or NSA is publishing or GCHQ. But if you have the level of maturity where you have incidents, whether or not they are declared incidents, or if your SecOps team or SOC is responding to issues, right? And whether that rises to a full-blown incident and whether there's a case file or not, that internal threat intelligence to your organization, right? You are the only group of people that have that information, and you probably should understand and be able to assess that. All right, you might be able to understand, like we are seeing these types of phishing attacks, for example, right? Which may or may not, there might not even be external threat information about that yet if you're the first person in your vertical to see that. So you might go looking for, the latest Mandiant report or the latest CrowdStrike report or something, but there might not be a report yet because you could be, patient zero for that phishing attack. So there's a balance between how much you rely on the external reports for information and how much you should also be paying attention to literally what is going on that you are seeing on your network, because that might be the most critical piece of intelligence.
All right. So we're going to take the last few minutes here to kind of take a look at Volt Typhoon as a case study. You've probably heard of Volt Typhoon at this point. It's been all the papers. This aspect of this case study goes back a little bit farther, and it goes back to this was June 2023, where we have the the Joint Cybersecurity Advisory, which was created by CISA, FBI, NSA. You can see all the different logos from a number of other countries that all pitched in to put this together. But this was focused on the actor and focusing on living off the land to evade detection. Now, I highly recommend you take a look at the report. If you haven't read the report, take a look at it. But the idea behind this, and for those not familiar with the terminology of living off the land, the idea here is that there are a set of binaries, a set of executables that are on a Windows system, but could be a Linux system in other cases, that administrators are going to use on a normal, regular occurring basis. So they're generally accepted to be seen in the environment. However, the adversary, by compromising that account or that system, is allowed and able to go ahead and run those different executables to glean information, gather reconnaissance, potentially dump credentials, and do all those kinds of little nasty things, but without having to use any of their own custom malware. So with that kind of level set here, right? And if I was going to kind of put this concepts to action, right? I have my threat, my external threat environment, right? Maybe I have internal threat data, to John's point earlier, that I could go ahead and leverage, but maybe I don't. So I'm kind of starting with a kind of a new slate, and I've got my external threat intelligence. I've got my organizations that I partnered with, in this case, CISA, who's providing me external data to help inform me about this. And the other thing that's unique, I think, to say about this specific case is that there really aren't any IOCs, if you read through this report, that when we say IOCs, hashes, domains, IP addresses, right? A lot of these things are actually around behaviors. They're actually things that somebody would do. Hey, I'm going to go ahead and run these kinds of commands with these kinds of command strings. So there's still threat intelligence to be gleaned from it, but it's not that kind of traditional IOC that maybe some other folks would expect. So if we kind of take that information, and again, we're going to apply this to the SecOps organization, the CTI team can still take those behaviors and say, hey, these are the kinds of behaviors that we're expecting this adversary, who may or may not be targeting us, depending upon, you know, the adversary's intentions and the vertical that we're in, can go ahead and say, these are the kinds of things that we're targeting for. And from a SOC perspective, the detection engineering team can go ahead and start building behavioral-based detections to say, hey, here are the kinds of things that we're seeing, and be able to say, these are the systems that are being targeted. These are the users that are being targeted, and start identifying those and being able to go ahead and work with incident response and other teams. At that point, incident response, or if I'm on the proactive side of this, that my threat hunters could go ahead and hypothesize about some of these behaviors, again, funded or fed, I should say, by the CTI team and their investigations and their research, can start hunting and start looking for these pieces and start pulling them together to say, what are the threads that we can see? What are the commonalities? Are we seeing a specific user on multiple systems that are running these living off the land binaries that really are kind of suspicious because they're running the specific commands that were called out as the behaviors in that reporting, right? So these are different places along the way that we, from a SecOps perspective, can take advantage of that CTI data and be able to use it in an operational spot that goes beyond just standard IOCs. Which then brings us into kind of the last step along the way here, which is a remediation step. Now, we can obviously go ahead and gather information, and one of the nice things that we can take with some of those IOCs in certain cases is we could go ahead and grab those and pull them in for the SecOps team to be aware of. But we can also go ahead and, you know, maybe knock this guy off the network, right? Knock that adversary off the network by going ahead and taking remediative action. But this is also one of those places where we start coming back into a little bit of a collision between the operations and intelligence. And this is something, again, that we probably need to make sure that the whole team is aware of before we get into this challenge. And that's oftentimes that from a SecOps perspective, I want to go ahead and knock this guy off the network, right? I want to go ahead and kill that connection, change the passwords, you know, make the pain go away, and we can start remediating immediately. But from John's perspective and a threat intel perspective, maybe he wants to go ahead and keep it going.
Yeah, this goes into having really strong incident response plans around this too, because if you're still determining whether or not it's an adversary, right? If they're using living off the land tactics, you might not be sure, is this an insider threat? Is this a rogue administrator maybe performing some action? Is it an actual APT using those things? So sometimes the intel team will want to let this play out, because you also, if you declare an incident, you want to make sure you have the full extent of where the adversary is. And if you don't have that threat intel picture, you might start incident response measures and have not fully contained the threat either. So there's a lot of things to consider before you do one or the other.
All right. So to kind of wrap all this up, hopefully we've convinced you that all of the data is very, very important. However, it may not all be useful to everyone. And so some thought needs to be put into, data collection, data sharing, ensuring the right folks have the right sets of data to do their mission.
Yeah, your priority intelligence requirements should really align to the organizational business goals. Business goals if it's a private company, or whatever the mission requirements are if it's like a SLED or government entity. And you want to try and get the right balance with all of that as well, right? You don't want to focus exclusively on internal or exclusively on external data. There is a balance, and all of that will probably depend on which specific use case you find yourself in.
And then from an establishing the standards, right, we want to stick to the basics, the things like the normalization of terminology, the timestamps, right? Those things feel like basics, but if you can go ahead and do those on the front end, it'll pay dividends on the back end. And this was kind of a common theme I heard this morning, both from Dr. Johnson's talk and from Sydney Jones's talk about Beyond the FOMO, is that teamwork piece of this is very, very crucial. We're talking about threat intel. We're talking about SecOps. We need to bring these pieces together with a joint common mission to be able to go ahead and help defend our network and keep that and be mindful of that throughout. At this point, I guess we've got to maybe, I don't know if we have a time for questions. I know we've got the Slack that we're out there with as well. And we'll be back and around and available. And this is our contact information. This is John Stoner. And I'm John Stoner.